Imagine designing the perfect society, not improving the one you live in, not reforming it at the edges, building one from scratch, on paper, from the ground up. Deciding who should lead, how they should be chosen, what they should own, how children should be raised, and what kind of person deserves to hold power over others. Now imagine doing this 24 centuries ago, in a small city on the Mediterranean, surrounded by war, political chaos, and the memory of a teacher the state had just executed for thinking too freely. That is what Plato did, and the blueprint he left behind has been read, debated, admired, and argued over for longer than almost any other piece of writing in human history. Not because anyone ever built the society he described. No one did. But because the questions he asked about justice, about power, about what makes a government legitimate, have never stopped being relevant. Every political thinker who came after him, whether they agreed with him or despised him, had to reckon with his ideas. This is the story of the man who invented political philosophy. Plato was born around 427 BC into one of the most distinguished families in Athens. This was not a man who came from the margins. His relatives moved in the highest circles of Athenian politics and society. He grew up surrounded by wealth, education, and the expectation that he would one day play a role in the governance of his city. But something happened to Plato in his youth that redirected the course of his life entirely. He met Socrates. Socrates was unlike any thinker Athens had produced. He didn't write books. He didn't lecture from a podium. He walked through the streets and the marketplaces, engaging anyone who would listen in conversation, asking questions that seemed simple, but invariably exposed the contradictions in people's most cherished beliefs. What is justice? What is courage? What does it mean to live a good life? Socrates didn't provide answers. He dismantled the false certainty of the answers other people gave. He was, depending on your perspective, either the greatest teacher who ever lived or the most irritating man in Athens. For Plato, he was a revelation. The young aristocrat became Socrates' devoted student and friend. He watched the older man challenge politicians, poets, and generals with the same relentless logic, never backing down, never accepting authority as a substitute for reason. And then, in 399 BC, Athens killed him. Socrates was 70 years old. The charges against him were vague and contradictory, impiety and corrupting the youth. The real offense, everyone understood, was that he made powerful people look foolish. A jury of Athenian citizens found him guilty. He was sentenced to death. He drank the hemlock in his prison cell, surrounded by his students, refusing every opportunity to escape or recant. Plato was devastated. He later wrote that Socrates was the wisest, most just, and best of all the men I have ever known. And the fact that this man, this extraordinary mind, had been condemned to death not by a tyrant, but by a democratic vote, by the collective decision of ordinary citizens, left a wound in Plato that never healed. From that moment on, Plato harbored a deep, abiding suspicion of democracy. If the people could vote to kill the best man among them, then the people could not be trusted with power. Shortly after Socrates' death, Plato left Athens. He traveled for the next 10 or 12 years, visiting Egypt, southern Italy, and Sicily, absorbing ideas, meeting other thinkers, and slowly developing the philosophical system that would become his life's work. Around 387 BC, he returned to Athens and founded a school. He called it the Academy. It was located in a grove of olive trees, sacred to the hero Academos, just outside the city walls, and it became the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. The Academy would continue to operate for over 900 years, an almost incomprehensible span of institutional continuity, finally closed by the Emperor Justinian in 529 AD. Every university that exists today is, in some sense, a descendant of what Plato built in that grove. For the remaining 40 years of his life, Plato taught at the Academy and wrote prolifically. 36 books, mostly in the form of dialogues, exploring politics, ethics, metaphysics, theology, epistemology, and the nature of reality itself. His most famous student arrived at the academy at the age of 17, a young man from the northern frontier of the Greek world named Aristotle, who would eventually become the only philosopher in history whose influence rivals Plato's own. Plato died in 347 BC at the age of 80. By then, his ideas had already begun their long journey through Western civilization. Now, summarizing the thought of a man who wrote 36 books across 4 decades is a dangerous exercise. You inevitably oversimplify. You flatten what is rich and nuanced. But if we focus on his most famous work, The Republic, we can at least sketch the outlines of the political vision that has fascinated and troubled readers for over 2,000 years. The Republic is Plato's attempt to describe the ideal human society, and his answer to the question of who should govern is both radical and, in its own way, deeply logical. The best form of government, Plato argued, is aristocracy, but not the kind of aristocracy most people think of, not hereditary nobility, not a ruling class determined by birth, blood, or wealth. What Plato meant was an aristocracy of merit. The state should be governed by the most capable, the most intelligent, the most virtuous people available. And these people should be identified not through popular elections, which Plato regarded as little more than popularity contests, but through a rigorous, lifelong process of education, testing, and selection. Plato called this ruling class the guardians, and the system he designed to produce them was, for its time, astonishingly modern in some respects and utterly alien in others. First, the principle. All people, men and women alike, should be given the opportunity to prove themselves worthy of entering the guardian class. Plato was the first major philosopher in Western history to argue for the fundamental equality of the sexes. This was not a casual aside. He meant it. In a world where women in Athens could not vote, could not own property independently, and were largely confined to the household, Plato looked at the prevailing assumptions about gender and dismissed them. If a woman demonstrated the intellectual and moral qualities required of a guardian, she should be admitted. Period. It would take more than 2,000 years for this idea to become common currency in Western political thought. To ensure genuine equality of opportunity, Plato proposed something equally radical. All children should be raised and educated by the state, not by their families, by the state. The goal was to eliminate the advantages of birth, wealth, and social connection. Every child would start from the same place and advance based solely on ability. The education Plato envisioned was comprehensive and demanding. Physical training came first, alongside music, mathematics, and the standard academic disciplines. At each stage, rigorous examinations would sort the students. Those who lacked the necessary aptitude would be directed toward the economic life of the community. They would become farmers, craftsmen, merchants, valuable roles, but not governing ones. Those who excelled would continue their education, progressing into more advanced studies, including what Plato called philosophy, by which he meant his own metaphysical doctrine of ideal forms. The theory that the physical world we perceive is merely a shadow of a higher, more perfect reality accessible only through reason. At 35, those who had mastered the theoretical foundations would enter a new phase, 15 years of practical experience. They would be tested not just on what they knew, but on whether they could apply their knowledge in the real world. Book learning, in Plato's system, was necessary but not sufficient. A guardian had to prove competence in practice. And even after all of this, not everyone who made it through would become a guardian. The final criterion was motive. Only those who demonstrated a genuine interest in the welfare of the community, rather than personal ambition or material gain, would be admitted to the ruling class. And here is where Plato's vision becomes something that no modern politician would voluntarily sign up for. Being a guardian was not a reward. It was closer to a monastic vocation. Guardians were forbidden from accumulating wealth. They could own only minimal personal property. No land, no houses, no gold, no silver. They received a fixed salary, and it was deliberately modest. They were not permitted to start families. Their lives were to be lived entirely within their own community, devoted entirely to public service. The only compensation was the satisfaction of serving the common good. It was, in effect, a proposal to make political power as unattractive as possible, so that only those who genuinely wanted to serve would seek it. Plato understood something about human nature that most political systems try to ignore. The people most eager for power are usually the least fit to wield it. By stripping the guardian class of every material incentive, he hoped to filter out the ambitious, the greedy, and the self-serving, leaving only those rare individuals who are driven by something deeper. The Republic has been one of the most widely read books in human history. And yet, no society has ever attempted to implement Plato's model. Not once. In the 23 centuries since he wrote it, Europe has been governed by hereditary monarchies, military dictatorships, demagogic tyrannies like those of Mussolini and Hitler, and, in more recent centuries, various forms of democracy. None of these systems bear more than a passing resemblance to what Plato described. Does that mean his ideas were irrelevant? That the Republic was admired in theory and ignored in practice? Not quite. Because if you look closely, Plato's fingerprints are visible in places you might not expect. Consider the Catholic Church in medieval Europe. The structural parallels with Plato's guardian class are remarkable. The Church constituted an educated elite, trained in a single official philosophy, whose members were drawn, in principle, from all social classes regardless of birth. Any man, whether he was the son of a peasant or a nobleman, could enter the priesthood. In principle, no one was excluded by origin. And once inside, the clergy were bound by celibacy. They could not marry. They could not raise families. Their lives were supposed to be devoted entirely to the care of their flock, to spiritual service, rather than material accumulation. The parallels are not exact. Women were excluded, which Plato would not have endorsed, and the reality of the medieval church often diverged wildly from its ideals, with corruption, wealth, and political ambition running rampant. But the structural resemblance, an educated, celibate governing class selected on merit rather than blood, is too close to be coincidental. The men who built the institutional framework of the medieval church had read their Plato. And then there is the United States. Many of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 were educated in the classics and familiar with Plato's political thought. The American system was designed to be democratic, yes, but it was also designed with a deep awareness of democracy's dangers. The Electoral College, the Senate, the system of checks and balances, the very idea that representatives should be chosen for their wisdom and judgment, rather than simply as mirrors of popular opinion. All of this carries echoes of Plato's insistence that governance requires more than a show of hands. The founders wanted popular sovereignty, but they also wanted filters, mechanisms to ensure that the wisest and most capable people would rise to positions of leadership. They didn't build Plato's Republic, nobody did, but they built something that was, in part, a conversation with it. And that ultimately is where Plato's importance lies. Not in any single policy adopted or government formed in his image. His influence has been broad and deep, but almost always indirect, woven so subtly into the fabric of Western thought that it is difficult to point to one specific moment and say, that was Plato. He didn't start a political movement. He didn't write a manifesto that sparked a revolution. What he did was ask questions, frame problems, and propose answers that have shaped how every subsequent generation has thought about politics, justice, and the purpose of the state. Beyond the Republic, Plato's contributions to ethics and metaphysics laid the groundwork for centuries of philosophical development. His theory of forms, the idea that the material world is an imperfect reflection of a higher, eternal reality, influenced Christian theology so profoundly that the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead once remarked that the entire European philosophical tradition consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. That is an exaggeration, of course, but it captures something true about the scale of his impact. If Plato stands slightly below Aristotle in the estimation of some historians, it is only because Aristotle was both a philosopher and a scientist, a man who contributed to biology, physics, logic, and political theory in ways that Plato, who was more purely a thinker of abstractions, did not. But Plato surpasses figures like Thomas Jefferson or Voltaire, not because his ideas were necessarily better, but because his influence has endured for 23 centuries. Jefferson's political writings shaped a few hundred years of history. Plato's have shaped 2,500. He was a man who watched his teacher drink poison at the hands of a democracy and spent the rest of his life trying to design a world in which that could never happen again. He never built that world, but the blueprint he left behind forced every civilization that read it to ask itself a question it could never quite answer. Who deserves to rule, and why? 24 centuries later, we are still arguing about it. And every time we do, whether we know it or not, we are arguing with Plato.